So this screencast is titled The Effects of Exercise on the Body Systems. So pure and simply, what we'll look at over this screencast is what happens to Homer Simpson's body when he takes part in the Springfield Marathon, so when he is immediately exercising, and in the short term, and also what happens after sustained exercise, so in the long term, what adaptations would his body experience as a result of a 6-week training program, for example, or continued sustained involvement in physical activity. The 4 body systems that you will have studied over the last 3 years will be the cardiovascular system, which is made up of the heart, the blood vessels, so veins, arteries and capillaries, and also blood. So we should think about those 3 components when we reflect on what's happening to the body during exercise and after sustained exercise. We'll also look at the respiratory system, which is made up of the lungs and the various air passages into the lungs. We'll look at the muscular system, so focusing on skeletal muscles throughout the body and what happens to them immediately when Homer starts running, and also 6 months down the line after sustained involvement, and also the skeletal system, so what happens to bones and what happens to joints. So we'll start off with the short-term effects of exercise on the cardiovascular system. So Homer's heart inside his chest, which, remember, the heart is about fist-sized ball of muscle, cardiac muscle, just to the left of the sternum. When he starts exercising at the onset of physical activity, the first effect will be that there's an increased heart rate. It's not really sufficient to just identify that its heart rate increases. It's important that you appreciate why and are able to explain why that happens. So his heart rate will go up from a resting value of, on average, about between 50 and 70 to maybe in excess of about 150, depending on the intensity of his activity. Why does this happen? This happens because the muscles that are functioning, the muscles that are working, have an increased demand for fuel, and the heart, being the pump mechanism for blood and the delivery of those nutrients, adapts because of that increased need, and increases the time the amount of contractions per minute to meet that demand for oxygen. The second effect of exercise is that blood pressure is increased. Blood pressure in the blood vessels around Homer's body will be increased because more blood is flowing through them. So whilst running, his arms and legs will have blood shunted to them. So more blood flow and an increased amount of blood is travelling through those vessels, which puts extra force or extra pressure on those walls. Blood that was previously distributed throughout the body is now being located en masse to those areas, so pressure will be higher. The third effect, which we mentioned then, was the shunting of blood. So that your body, in its clever ways, will identify where blood is needed and redistribute it from areas of low need, as mentioned previously, with the increased blood pressure. So to be clear, these are things that will be happening to Homer's heart, his blood vessels and his blood when he starts this half marathon or marathon. On the flip side then, if Homer continues to maintain his involvement in physical activity over a period of time, he has the opportunity to experience these positive benefits on that body system. So the first thing is that you will have an increased stroke volume and cardiac output. So stroke volume is the amount of blood that leaves the aorta, so the major artery attached to the heart, per beat. So this goes up because he's got a bigger, stronger heart now because of the stress and the pressure put on it. It's going to adapt just like his skeletal muscles. It's going to get bigger, so larger than a fist, which means that every contraction is more explosive and powerful, and more blood can be ejected per beat. This is really positive because it means that heart rate doesn't need to be as high to get the same volume of blood out, which means that ultimately the heart's under less stress, which might have an implication on health. And because stroke volume has gone up, the amount of blood leaving the heart per minute, which is cardiac output, will also increase. So just to be clear, we need to not only be able to identify the long-term effects of exercise on the cardiovascular system, we also need to know how that affects health. So this one, because the heart's bigger and stronger and these two volumes are higher, it means that heart rate doesn't need to be as high and the heart is under less stress, so at less risk of heart attacks. The second effect in the long term is more red blood cells. So we'll have a higher number of red blood cells in our body, which means our oxygen carrying capacity is higher. So this is good for physical activity because it means that we've got more capacity to show endurance and to sustain physical activity or exercise and keep energy levels up. But it's also good for health because more red blood cells in the body, the more delivery of nutrients, the higher our energy levels, which again in turn will mean we've got more motivation or more energy to take part in our daily tasks. A decreased resting heart rate is the third effect. So because, as mentioned before, the heart is bigger, more explosive in its contractions, our resting heart rate can decrease. So if before this program his was at 75, it might drop down to about 65 now that there's more blood going out per beat. Resting blood pressure will be lower, so the blood vessels around the body will have less resistance and less force being put on them because they're more elastic, and they can deal with that increased blood flow a little bit more readily. This is good because it avoids conditions like hypertension, which can be very detrimental to health. We have cardiac hypertrophy, so as mentioned again, the heart getting bigger and stronger means it doesn't have to beat as often, means less risk of heart attacks. And the final one is a faster recovery time. So when we've finished exercising, our body returns to its resting values or resting state much quicker. Moving on to the respiratory system then. So for the short-term effects, we need to be able to identify these 4 effects on Homer's respiratory system, and we also need to know why it occurs. So the first thing is that there'll be an increase in tidal volume. This basically just means that he'll be breathing deeper. So tidal volume is the amount of air per breath going in and out of the lungs. So when we exercise, we breathe deeper, more air goes in and out, again to meet the demands for oxygen that the body has to release energy. Secondly, there'll be an increased breathing rate, so the number of breaths I have per minute will increase. Alright, so the frequency of breaths, again for the very same reason, because the body wants more oxygen and the respiratory system supports that by increasing the number of breaths. The third one is increased minute volume. Minute volume is the amount of air going in and out of the lungs per minute, and because these two have gone up, as a consequence, so will minute volume. And the final one is that there will be an oxygen debt that needs to be repaid. This occurs because of the production of energy anaerobically throughout physical activity for various surges in energy or at the onset of physical activity, which means that we might need to have an increased tidal volume, breathing rate and minute volume to accommodate the effects of that anaerobic respiration, such as increased lactic acid. So we breathe more frequently and deeper post-exercise to repay that debt and return to our resting state. The long-term effects on the respiratory system, and we've got to be able to identify them and also know the implications of them on health. The first one is that I have an increased lung capacity, or Homer does, if he continues involvement in physical activity. This means he can take more air into his lungs per breath and per minute. The consequence of that is more oxygen, which means that his organs are getting a greater supply. So the brain has a rich supply for concentration, and the organs have a rich supply for their functioning, as well as the muscles being higher in energy as a result. Vital capacity goes up. Your vital capacity is the amount of air you're able to exhale after the maximum inhalation. So it represents efficient lungs. So an efficient pair of lungs can remove high volumes of air when we breathe out. This is quite important for asthmatics and a good indicator of asthma if you have a low vital capacity. So if I'm fitter, like Homer here, my vital capacity will be really high. The consequence of this is, again, more efficient system that allows for clean oxygen to be taken in and unpleasant carbon dioxide to be removed. Residual volume will go down, which is by nature of it, residue, the waste air or waste products that sometimes remain inside our lungs. A fit Homer Simpson will have a low residue amount of air, representing again the fact that his lungs are efficient. This is good again for the same reasons before. And finally, Homer will have more alveoli now, so he'll have more capacity and more surface area to exchange gases, to get oxygen into his blood and to get carbon dioxide out, and for all the benefits we mentioned before. The third body system is the muscular system. So Homer, when running the marathon, will experience unpleasantly an increase in his lactic acid levels. So lactic acid will start to build up in his legs and in his shoulders and in his back maybe. Now, why does that happen? That happens because of the anaerobic production of energy, so without oxygen. So when he needs immediate energy, when he needs explosive high intensity energy, his body has to do that anaerobically. So as a result, the byproduct of that lack of oxygen is lactic acid, which can serve, some people believe, to be like a poison to muscles that brings about fatigue and discomfort. There'll be an increased demand for fuel, so those fuels being oxygen and glucose. So that fuel needs to be met by some of the other body systems. That happens because of stores being used up of both of those nutrients. Muscle fatigue occurs, so muscles will start to fail, muscles will start to lose their stores and start to diminish in their capacity to continue to contract. And then the final one is an increase in blood supply and muscle temperature. So because more blood is being shunted to these muscles to give those nutrients, as a result, temperature will also increase, making them more elastic. Then the long-term effects on the muscular system, as prominent in this picture of Homer, are that he will experience muscular hypertrophy, so his muscles will increase in size and mass. That's a result of physical activity creating micro tears in his muscles, that through an appropriate diet, a high protein diet, those tears are repaired and muscles become bigger. This is good for health because muscle size is associated with good posture and also good strength that can be really functional for daily tasks, and also protects the body as well. An increase in muscular strength and endurance, so because of the resistance that muscles are having to overcome during exercise, they increase in their strength and their capacity to continue to contract. This is also good for daily tasks and meeting the needs of your environment, and whatever that environment might be. And then finally, you'll have a higher lactic acid threshold. That means that the anaerobic impact of lactic acid takes longer to kick in, which means that you can sustain anaerobic exercise for longer periods of time. And then the final body system is the skeletal system. And we don't normally associate physical activity supporting this system, but we can see here that the final body system that we're going to cover in the last minute of this screencast is the skeletal system. So there's only one immediate effect on the skeletal system of exercise in the short term, and that is that joints become more mobilized. So because Homer is shunting blood to key working areas and those muscles are increasing in temperature, those joints become more mobile and more flexible as a result of that increased temperature. The long-term effects are that bones will become more dense as a result of the weight-bearing activity, which means that he's less prone to osteoporosis. The next three all link to the improvement of joints. So a thicker cartilage at joints will mean less chance of osteoarthritis and grinding of bones. An increase in synovial fluid will mean that movement's more comfortable and pleasant and lubricated, and stronger ligaments and tendons mean less likely to get ruptures, tendinitis and sprains.